In the summer of 1864, on a beach in what is now the Russian resort city of Sochi, Russian imperial officers held a celebration. They drank, they gave speeches, they congratulated one another on a great victory. Beneath their boots, and this is not metaphor, lay the remains of an entire civilization. A people who had lived in those mountains for thousands of years had just been destroyed. Approximately 1.5 million of them were dead. The survivors had been loaded onto rotting ships and cast into the sea. And within a generation, the world had almost entirely forgotten their name. They were called the Circassians, 12 tribes of the northwestern Caucasus, a mountain people who had built one of the most sophisticated warrior cultures in human history. They were not a footnote, they were a civilization. And what happened to them between 1763 and 1864 was, by every modern legal definition of the word, a genocide. This is not contested by historians. It is contested only by governments, chiefly one. The story of the Circassians is not simply a story of ethnic cleansing. It is the story of how an empire raises a people, and then erases the erasure. You have almost certainly never been taught this. That is not an accident. To understand what was lost, you must first understand what existed. The Circassians, who called themselves the Adyghe, occupied the northwestern rim of the Caucasus Mountains for millennia. 12 distinct tribes, each with their own dialect, their own traditions, their own territorial lands, and yet unified under a single cultural code, the Zabzi. This was not merely a set of customs. The Zabzi governed every dimension of life, honor, hospitality, warfare, gender relations, conflict resolution. European travelers who encountered the Circassians in the 18th century were consistently struck by the same thing: a people of extraordinary dignity, fierce independence, and a social order that functioned without kings or khans. The Venetian diplomat Interiano, writing in 1502, called them the most handsome people in the world. That observation was common. What was less commonly noted was that their beauty, their culture, their language, their entire way of being, rested on land. Specific land. The Black Sea coast, the mountain passes, the river valleys that fed their villages. Take the land, and you take everything. The Circassian homeland sat at one of the most strategically valuable crossroads on Earth. To the north, the Russian steppe, and an empire expanding southward with relentless hunger. To the south, the Ottoman Empire, looking northward with equal interest. The Circassians had spent centuries navigating these pressures, trading, allying, resisting. They were not naive. They understood precisely what Russian expansion meant. When Peter the Great established the first Russian fort lines near Circassian territory in the early 18th century, the Adyghe did not submit. They adapted. They fortified. They prepared for a war they could see coming decades in advance. What they could not have prepared for was its duration, its scale, or its ultimate aim, which was not to conquer them, but to remove them entirely from the map. The Russian Empire, under Catherine II and then her successors, did not want Circassian subjects. It wanted Circassian land, and it wanted that land clean. The mountains had protected the Adyghe for so long that it was almost possible to believe they always would. Almost. Because by the mid-19th century, Russia had learned something critical. The Circassians could not be defeated in the open field, so they would simply be starved, banned out, and encircled. What was coming was not a war in any conventional sense. It was a procedure. The Russo-Circassian War began formally in 1763 and ended in 1864. 101 years. It is, by most historical measures, the longest colonial war Russia ever fought. The fact that most people cannot name it, let alone describe it, tells you something about how history gets written. The early decades were characterized by raids, counter-raids, and brutal frontier violence on both sides. But the war changed fundamentally in 1816 when Tsar Alexander I appointed General Alexei Yermolov as commander of Russian forces in the Caucasus. Yermolov was not interested in negotiation. He was interested in eradication. In his own words, words he put in writing, words that survive, he stated that he wanted to make the Caucasus impenetrable to the cowardly Asiatics. He ordered the systematic destruction of Circassian villages. He burned crops. He poisoned wells. He drove populations from their ancestral lands into the high passes, where winter would do the work his soldiers could not. This was not a military strategy in the traditional sense. It was demographic engineering by violence. The Circassians resisted. For decades, they resisted with a ferocity that stunned Russian military commanders. Their fighters, the Uzden, the warrior nobility, were among the finest cavalry fighters in the world. European military observers sent to study the conflict came back with reports that read almost like admiration. The Circassians used terrain with genius. They understood the passes. They struck and disappeared into forests that Russian supply lines could not penetrate. For a time, and this is the part history tends to omit, they were winning, or at least, not losing. The resistance found a broader axis in the figure of Imam Shamil, the Adyghe military and spiritual leader, who unified much of the Eastern Caucasian resistance under the banner of jihad against Russian colonialism. Shamil held off Russian forces for 25 years, but his capture in 1859 left the Circassians strategically isolated. The Russian military now refocused its full attention westward, toward the 12 Adyghe tribes, toward the Black Sea coast, and this time, there would be no negotiation. By 1862, Russian General Nikolai Yevdokimov had devised a systematic plan of operations that functioned less like a military campaign and more like a controlled demolition. Column by column, valley by valley, the Russian army pushed Circassian populations toward the coast. Villages that did not surrender were burned. Families that did not relocate were killed. The mountain passes, the escape routes, the supply lines, the lifelines, were sealed one by one throughout the winter of 1863. The Circassians had retreated as far as the land would allow. Behind them, the Black Sea. Before them, the Russian army. There was nowhere left to go. By winter of 1863, the trap had closed entirely. What came next was not a battle. It was a procedure. On May 21, 1864, Grand Duke Mikhail Nikolaevich, commander of Russian forces in the Caucasus and brother of Tsar Alexander II, held a formal military ceremony at the Valley of Kbada, a place the Circassians considered sacred. Russian forces had gathered there not because the last battle had been fought there. It had been fought weeks before, but because this location, at the heart of Circassian ancestral territory, made the symbolism complete. They raised flags. They gave toasts. They declared the Caucasian War officially over. The civilization whose land they were standing on had been given a choice: deportation or death. Most had already chosen, or had the choice made for them. The deportations had begun months earlier. The Russian military had negotiated a deal with the Ottoman Empire to accept Circassian refugees. The word refugee doing considerable work here, since these were people being expelled from their homeland under military force. Ships were sent to the Black Sea coast to collect them. And this is where the documented record becomes almost impossible to comprehend. British diplomatic dispatches from the period. Read them. They exist in the Public Record Office in London. Describe scenes at the ports that their authors struggled to put into professional language. Tens of thousands of people crowded onto beaches with no shelter, no food, no clean water. The sick lying beside the dead. Ships so overcrowded that passengers could not sit down during crossings of multiple days. Ships arriving in Ottoman ports carrying hundreds of corpses. Ships that never arrived at all. The British consul in Trabzon, reporting in 1864, estimated that between 1/10 and 1/4 of all deportees died during the crossing alone. That is before accounting for those who died on the beaches waiting to board. Before accounting for those who were killed outright and never reached the shore. The numbers, assembled from Russian military records, Ottoman intake registers, survivor testimonies, and contemporary diplomatic reports, are staggering. Historians estimate that of the approximately 1.5 million Circassians living in the northwestern Caucasus before the war's final phase, between 600,000 and 1.5 million died from combat, starvation, disease, exposure, and drowning. The range reflects the deliberate incompleteness of Russian record-keeping, not uncertainty about the scale. The survivors, perhaps 300,000, perhaps fewer, were resettled across Ottoman territories, where many died of disease within years of arrival. The villages they had left behind were not repopulated by other peoples. They were erased. Russian settlers were brought in. The forests were cleared. The rivers were renamed. And on the coast of the Black Sea, where Circassian families had once built their lives across thousands of years of continuous habitation, a resort town began to grow. Its new name was Sochi. In every genocide, there are two phases. The first is the killing. The second is the erasure of the killing. The Russian Empire was thorough in both. Under the Tsars, Circassian history was simply not taught. Under the Soviets, who inherited the empire's borders and, in many ways, its logic, the suppression continued. The Circassian people who remained within Soviet territory were classified, reclassified, and administratively fragmented. Their homeland was divided into separate autonomous regions with different names, designed to prevent the emergence of a unified Adyghe political identity. The very word Circassian was, at various points in Soviet history, treated as a politically suspect term. Languages were suppressed. Cultural practices were discouraged. The Zabzi, the ancient honor code that had defined Adyghe civilization for millennia, was systematically dismantled. What the Russian military had started with guns, Soviet bureaucracy continued with paper. The wound that refuses to close came to global attention, briefly, momentarily, in 2014. That year, Russia hosted the Winter Olympic Games. The location, Sochi, the very city built on the graves of the Circassian homeland, Circassian diaspora communities across the world, and today, there are between 5 and 7 million Circassians living outside their ancestral lands. More than live within them. Organized protests, petitions, and public statements. They asked, simply, that Russia acknowledge what had happened on that ground before the world came to celebrate on it. Russia refused. The International Olympic Committee said nothing. The games proceeded. The cameras did not linger on what lay beneath the ski slopes. To date, Russia has not recognized the Circassian genocide. The list of countries that have, including Georgia, Ukraine, and several others, remains politically charged. Their recognitions often motivated as much by geopolitical calculation as by historical conscience. But recognition has come, and the Circassian diaspora, scattered across Turkey, Jordan, Syria, Israel, the United States, and Europe, has not forgotten. They have preserved language. They have preserved dance, music, the fragments of the Zabzi. They have kept the date, May 21st. Every year, on the anniversary of the ceremony at Kvada, Circassians around the world mark what they call the Day of Mourning. Not a day of anger, a day of remembrance, because to be forgotten is, in a certain way, to be killed twice, and they have refused, against considerable institutional pressure, to die that second death. The Circassian genocide did not happen in the shadows of history. It happened in the open, documented by diplomats, witnessed by journalists, recorded in the military dispatches of the empire that carried it out. It was not hidden. It was simply deprioritized, placed behind other stories, allowed to fade. That is how most atrocities survive in plain sight, not through secrecy, through the quiet agreement of powerful institutions to look elsewhere. The Circassians existed. They built something extraordinary in those mountains, over thousands of years, and in the span of a single century, erased. What we owe them is not pity, it is attention, because the question is never whether history remembers. The question is, who decides what it remembers and what it is allowed to forget?